The ancient city of Troy stood majestically on the hills overlooking the Hellespont, its towering walls catching the first light of dawn as they had for countless generations. The city's strategic position controlling the vital trade routes between Europe and Asia had made it one of the wealthiest and most powerful centers in the ancient world. Within these formidable fortifications lived King Priam, a ruler whose wisdom and justice had brought prosperity to his people for decades. His palace, constructed of fine marble and decorated with precious metals, reflected the accumulated wealth of generations of successful trade and diplomatic alliances that had made Troy the envy of neighboring kingdoms. The royal household of Troy was blessed with numerous children, but none more beloved than Prince Hector, whose courage and honor had already made him legendary throughout the ancient world. His younger brother Paris, while possessed of extraordinary beauty and charm, had always shown more interest in the pleasures of court life than in the serious responsibilities of royal duty. The contrast between the two brothers would prove to be one of the defining elements in the tragedy that was about to unfold, as their different natures would lead them down paths that would ultimately determine the fate of their entire civilization. The divine realm above Mount Olympus watched the affairs of mortals with keen interest, particularly when those affairs involved matters of honor, beauty, and power that resonated with their own immortal concerns. The goddess Aphrodite, whose domain encompassed love and beauty in all their forms, had long observed the exceptional attractiveness of Prince Paris and had begun to consider how his gifts might serve her own purposes. Her fellow deities, Hera, queen of the gods, and Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, maintained their own interests in mortal affairs, particularly when those interests involved the delicate balance of power that governed relationships between cities and kingdoms. The wedding celebration of Peleus and Thetis, a mortal hero and a sea nymph, brought together all the major deities of the Greek pantheon in a festival that was intended to honor the union of divine and mortal natures. The festivities were elaborate and magnificent, with music, dancing, and feasting that befitted such an important occasion. However, the deliberate exclusion of Eris, the goddess of discord, from the invitation list proved to be a catastrophic oversight that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate celebration. The goddess's anger at this slight was not merely personal wounded pride, but a cosmic force of chaos that demanded expression and would not be easily contained or appeased. Eris's revenge took the form of a golden apple, inscribed with the words, "For the fairest," which she cast into the midst of the wedding celebration, where it immediately became the center of a dispute that would escalate beyond all rational proportion. The apple's beauty was supernatural, crafted from materials that existed only in the divine realm and imbued with power that made it irresistibly attractive to anyone who beheld it. The three goddesses who each claimed the apple as rightfully theirs represented different aspects of feminine power and authority, creating a conflict that could not be resolved through normal diplomatic means or divine hierarchy. The competition that emerged between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite for possession of the golden apple threatened to destabilize the entire divine order, as each goddess commanded legions of supporters and possessed the power to wage war on a cosmic scale. The dispute required resolution through an impartial judge who could render a decision that would be accepted by all parties, despite the inevitable disappointment of the losers. The choice of Paris as this judge was not arbitrary, but reflected his reputation for fairness and his status as someone whose life had not yet become entangled in the complex political relationships that might bias his judgment. The journey of the three goddesses to Mount Ida, where Paris tended his flocks in peaceful obscurity, was marked by supernatural phenomena that announced their approach to every creature in the region. The very air seemed to shimmer with divine presence, while the landscape itself appeared to glow with otherworldly light that transformed the familiar pastoral setting into something resembling the celestial realm. Paris, despite his royal birth and divine heritage through his prophetic abilities, found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of the responsibility that was being placed upon him and the potential consequences of any decision he might make. The contest that unfolded before Paris was not merely a comparison of physical beauty, but a demonstration of the different types of power and influence that each goddess could offer to mortals who earned their favor. Hera appeared in her aspect as Queen of the Gods, her presence radiating the authority and dignity that came from ruling over the divine hierarchy. Her offer of political power and dominion over vast territories appealed to the ambitious aspects of Paris's nature, promising him influence that would extend far beyond the boundaries of Troy and make him one of the most powerful rulers in the known world. Athena manifested in her role as goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, her appearance combining intellectual brilliance with military prowess in ways that commanded both respect and admiration. Her promise of victory in battle and wisdom in governance addressed Paris's potential concerns about his ability to rule effectively and protect his people from the various threats that faced ancient kingdoms. The goddess offered him not just success, but the knowledge and skill necessary to achieve that success through his own merit and ability. Aphrodite's presentation was perhaps the most subtle and psychologically sophisticated, as she appeared not in her role as a powerful deity, but as the embodiment of love and beauty itself. Her promise was not political power or military victory, but something more personal and emotionally compelling, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta, whose beauty was already legendary throughout the ancient world, became the prize that would tip the balance of Paris's decision in favor of the goddess of love, despite the obvious complications that such a choice would create. The judgment that Paris rendered in favor of Aphrodite was based not on careful consideration of the long-term consequences, but on the immediate emotional appeal of the goddess's offer and his own romantic nature. The decision to award the golden apple to Aphrodite was simultaneously a rejection of the other two goddesses, creating divine enemies whose anger would manifest in the destruction that was about to engulf Troy. The personal nature of the choice, driven by desire rather than wisdom, established a pattern that would characterize many of the decisions that led to the Trojan War. The journey of Paris to Sparta was ostensibly a diplomatic mission designed to strengthen the bonds of friendship between Troy and the various Greek kingdoms. King Menelaus of Sparta received the Trojan prince with the hospitality that was expected between royal houses, providing him with comfortable accommodations and opportunities to experience the refinements of Spartan court life. The political discussions that took place during this visit covered topics of mutual interest, including trade agreements and military alliances that could benefit both kingdoms, creating an atmosphere of cooperation and trust that made the subsequent betrayal all the more shocking. Helen of Sparta was indeed possessed of the extraordinary beauty that had made her famous throughout the ancient world, but her attractiveness went beyond mere physical perfection to encompass a grace and intelligence that made her conversation as captivating as her appearance. Her marriage to Menelaus had been arranged for political reasons, as was common among royal families, but had developed into a relationship characterized by mutual respect and affection. The stability of their household and the happiness of their domestic arrangements made Helen's eventual departure all the more unexpected and devastating. The seduction of Helen by Paris was not accomplished through force or deception, but through the irresistible power of divine intervention as Aphrodite worked to fulfill her promise to the Trojan prince. The goddess created circumstances and opportunities that brought the two together in settings where their mutual attraction could develop naturally, while simultaneously clouding their judgment about the consequences of their actions. The love that grew between Paris and Helen was genuine and powerful, but it was also influenced by supernatural forces that made resistance to their desires virtually impossible. The elopement of Helen and Paris from Sparta was conducted under cover of darkness while Menelaus was away on official business, creating a betrayal that violated both the laws of hospitality and the sacred bonds of marriage. The lovers took with them not only Helen's personal possessions, but also substantial treasures from the Spartan royal treasury, transforming their romantic escape into an act of theft that added economic injury to the personal insult inflicted upon Menelaus. The ship that carried them across the wine-dark sea toward Troy bore passengers whose actions would ignite a conflict that would consume a generation and transform the political landscape of the ancient world. The discovery of Helen's disappearance created an immediate crisis in Sparta as Menelaus struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal that had been committed against him personally and against the honor of his kingdom. The empty chambers that had once housed his wife and her belongings stood as silent testimony to a violation that demanded response, not merely for personal satisfaction, but to maintain the respect and authority that were essential for effective rule. The missing treasures added insult to injury, providing tangible evidence of theft that gave the cuckolded king legal as well as moral justification for seeking redress. The call to arms that Menelaus issued to his fellow Greek rulers was based on more than personal grievance, as it invoked the sacred oath that all of Helen's former suitors had sworn before her marriage. This oath, administered by her stepfather Tyndareus, bound every man who had sought her hand to defend her chosen husband against any who might threaten their union. The political wisdom of this arrangement had been apparent at the time, as it prevented rivalry among the rejected suitors and created a network of alliances that would support the successful candidate. However, the activation of these oaths would require the participants to honor commitments made years earlier under very different circumstances. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother to the wronged Menelaus, emerged as the natural leader of the Greek response to the Trojan insult. His position as the most powerful ruler among the Greek kingdoms gave him the authority and resources necessary to organize a military expedition on the massive scale that would be required to assault Troy's formidable defenses. The strategic thinking that guided his planning recognized that the conflict would not be a brief campaign, but a prolonged siege that would test the endurance and resources of both sides to their limits. The recruitment of warriors for the expedition required careful diplomacy and negotiation, as many of the kings who were bound by the oath had their own concerns and priorities that needed to be addressed. Some rulers were reluctant to commit their forces to a campaign that might last years and leave their own territories vulnerable to attack by enemies who would take advantage of their absence. Others questioned whether the recovery of a single woman, however beautiful, justified the enormous cost in lives and resources that such an expedition would require. Among the most important recruits to the Greek cause was Achilles, the young prince of the Myrmidons whose reputation for courage and skill in battle had already made his name famous throughout the Greek world. His divine ancestry through his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, had endowed him with capabilities that exceeded those of ordinary mortals, while his training under the centaur Chiron had perfected his skills in all the arts of war. However, his participation in the expedition was complicated by a prophecy that foretold his death at Troy if he chose to join the campaign, creating a personal dilemma that reflected the broader themes of fate and choice that would run throughout the conflict. The decision of Achilles to join the expedition despite the prophetic warning about his fate demonstrated the heroic code that valued glory and honor above personal safety and longevity. His choice was not made lightly, but after careful consideration of what kind of life was worth living and what kind of death was worth dying. The young warrior understood that he could live a long and peaceful life in obscurity, or he could achieve immortal fame through deeds that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. His decision to choose glory over longevity would prove to be one of the defining elements of the entire war. The assembly of the Greek fleet at Aulis created a gathering of warriors and ships that was unprecedented in the history of the ancient world. Over 1,000 vessels of various sizes and configurations filled the harbor, their crews representing dozens of different kingdoms and city-states that had put aside their usual rivalries to participate in this common cause. The sight of so many ships and warriors gathered in one place was both inspiring and intimidating, demonstrating the collective power of the Greek world when united behind a single purpose. The delay at Aulis caused by unfavorable winds created tensions within the expedition that threatened to undermine its unity before it could even reach Troy. The various kings and their followers, accustomed to action and uncomfortable with prolonged inactivity, began to question the wisdom of the entire enterprise and to consider returning to their own territories where more immediate concerns demanded their attention. The supernatural nature of the adverse weather conditions suggested divine intervention, requiring religious as well as practical solutions to resolve the crisis. The sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter, demanded by the goddess Artemis as the price for favorable winds, represented one of the most controversial and morally complex decisions of the entire war. The prophet Calchas, whose divine insights revealed the goddess's demands, placed the expedition's leader in an impossible position that forced him to choose between his duty as a father and his responsibilities as commander of the Greek forces. The decision to sacrifice his daughter demonstrated Agamemnon's commitment to the expedition's success, but it also created a moral stain that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate crisis. The voyage from Aulis to the Trojan coast was accomplished with favorable winds that carried the massive fleet across the Wine-dark Sea in record time, creating an impressive display of naval power that announced the Greeks' arrival to every kingdom along their route. The sight of so many ships approaching the Trojan shores must have been both magnificent and terrifying to the defenders who watched from the city walls as their enemies established beachheads and began the process of creating a fortified camp that would serve as their base of operations for the siege to come. The initial battles that marked the beginning of the siege demonstrated the military capabilities of both sides and established the patterns of warfare that would characterize the conflict for the next decade. The Greeks, fighting far from their home territories, needed to achieve decisive victories that would quickly break Trojan resistance and allow them to capture the city before their supplies and morale were exhausted. The Trojans, defending their own soil and supported by their accumulated wealth and established supply lines, could afford to fight a war of attrition that would gradually wear down their enemies' resolve and resources. The duel between Menelaus and Paris, proposed as a means of settling the conflict without further bloodshed, represented a moment when the war might have ended quickly with minimal loss of life on both sides. The terms agreed upon by both armies made the personal combat between the wronged husband and the man who had stolen his wife into a trial by combat that would determine not only their individual fates, but the outcome of the entire conflict. The failure of this duel to produce a decisive resolution, due to divine intervention that rescued Paris from certain defeat, demonstrated how the gods' involvement in mortal affairs could complicate even the most straightforward attempts at justice. The intervention of Athena, who influenced the Trojan archer Pandarus to break the truce by shooting at Menelaus, transformed what might have been an honorable resolution into a treacherous violation that reignited the conflict with renewed intensity. The goddess's action was motivated by her anger at Paris's judgment in favor of Aphrodite, but its consequences extended far beyond personal divine revenge to encompass the destruction of thousands of innocent lives. The incident demonstrated how the gods' petty rivalries could have devastating effects on the mortal world, turning minor slights into cosmic disasters. The years of siege warfare that followed created a pattern of daily combat that tested the endurance and resources of both sides while achieving little decisive progress toward final victory. The Greeks, encamped on the beaches outside Troy's walls, faced constant challenges in maintaining their supply lines and keeping their forces motivated for a conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. The Trojans, secure behind their fortifications but unable to break the siege, watched their city gradually wear down under the constant pressure of warfare and economic blockade. The catalogue of heroes who distinguished themselves during these years of fighting reads like a roll call of legendary warriors whose names would echo through the ages. Ajax the Great, with his massive shield and incredible strength, held the Greek left flank against repeated Trojan assaults. Diomedes, the young king of Argos, proved his worth by wounding gods themselves in single combat. On the Trojan side, Hector's courage and leadership inspired his men to feats of heroism that kept the city's defenses intact despite overwhelming odds, while Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, fought with divine favor that protected him from mortal weapons. The personal rivalry between Achilles and Hector came to symbolize the larger conflict between Greek ambition and Trojan resistance, as the two greatest warriors of their respective sides sought opportunities to meet in single combat that would prove their individual worth and advance their army's causes. Their encounters on the battlefield became the stuff of legend, with each warrior demonstrating skills and courage that elevated them above ordinary mortals and made their eventual confrontation inevitable. The death of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, marked the turning point of the war and the beginning of its final phase. Patroclus had donned Achilles' armor and led the Myrmidons into battle in an attempt to break the Trojan advance that threatened to burn the Greek ships. But his inexperience and overconfidence led him into a trap where Hector struck him down in single combat. The loss of his closest friend shattered Achilles' withdrawal from the fighting and brought him back into the war with a fury that would prove unstoppable. The grief and rage that consumed Achilles after Patroclus's death transformed him from a proud but essentially rational warrior into an instrument of divine vengeance whose sole purpose was to make the Trojans pay for his loss. His new armor, forged by Hephaestus himself and decorated with scenes that depicted the entire cosmos, marked him as a hero who had transcended ordinary human limitations and become something approaching a force of nature. The shield's elaborate imagery, showing cities at peace and war, agricultural scenes, and cosmic symbols, represented the totality of human experience that Achilles was prepared to sacrifice in pursuit of his revenge. The final duel between Achilles and Hector took place outside the walls of Troy before the assembled armies of both sides, creating a spectacle that would be remembered and retold for generations to come. Hector, knowing that he was likely to die but unable to refuse the challenge without losing honor, met his fate with the courage that had defined his entire life. His death at Achilles' hands was not merely the loss of Troy's greatest defender, but the symbolic moment when the city's doom became inevitable. The desecration of Hector's body, dragged behind Achilles' chariot around the walls of Troy for 12 days, represented the Greek hero's complete abandonment of the honor code that was supposed to govern heroic behavior. The sight of their greatest champion being treated with such disrespect broke the morale of the Trojan defenders and demonstrated to everyone the depth of Achilles' rage and his willingness to violate every law of decency in pursuit of his revenge. King Priam's journey to the Greek camp to ransom his son's body was an act of courage that rivaled any deed performed on the battlefield, as the elderly king ventured alone into the midst of his enemies to appeal directly to the man who had killed his son. The meeting between Priam and Achilles became a moment of recognition between two men who had both lost what they held most dear to the necessities of war, creating a temporary bridge of understanding across the chasm of hatred that separated their peoples. The funeral of Hector provided a brief respite from the fighting, as both sides observed a truce that allowed the Trojans to honor their fallen hero with ceremonies befitting his status and achievements. The elaborate ritual, with its processions, sacrifices, and games, gave the defenders one last moment of unity and pride before the final disasters that would destroy their city and their civilization. The death of Achilles, struck down by an arrow guided by Apollo to his one vulnerable spot, marked the end of the war's heroic phase and the beginning of its conclusion through trickery rather than valor. The loss of their greatest warrior was a devastating blow to Greek morale, but it also freed them from the limitations that Achilles' presence had imposed on their tactical thinking. Without the need to accommodate his pride and desire for personal glory, the Greek commanders could consider strategies that relied on cunning rather than strength. The wooden horse, conceived by Odysseus and constructed by the master craftsman Hippias, represented a final desperate gamble that would either bring victory or complete disaster to the Greek cause. The enormous construction, large enough to hold dozens of warriors while appearing to be a religious offering, required skills and materials that pushed the technical capabilities of ancient engineering to their limits. The hollow interior was carefully designed to accommodate the selected warriors while providing them with air and space to remain hidden during the crucial period when the horse would be inside Troy's walls. The selection of warriors to hide inside the horse required careful consideration of both military capability and psychological suitability, as the men chosen would need to remain silent and motionless for extended periods while surrounded by enemies. The final group included the most experienced and reliable fighters from various Greek contingents, ensuring that the force that would emerge from the horse would be capable of accomplishing their mission despite being vastly outnumbered by the defenders they would face. The debate within Troy about whether to accept the horse as a gift or reject it as a trick revealed the divisions that years of siege had created among the city's leadership. Laocoon, the priest who warned against trusting the Greeks even when bearing gifts, represented the voice of caution and wisdom that might have saved the city if his warnings had been heeded. However, the appearance of sea serpents that killed both Laocoon and his sons was interpreted as divine punishment for rejecting a sacred offering, convincing the Trojans to bring the horse within their walls. The night that followed was filled with celebrations as the Trojans, believing that the war was finally over and that they had emerged victorious, indulged in festivities that left them unprepared for the disaster that was about to unfold. The wine flowed freely, guards abandoned their posts to join the revelry, and the city's defenses were relaxed for the first time in a decade. The very joy that the Trojans felt at their apparent deliverance made them vulnerable to the treachery that was about to destroy everything they had fought to preserve. The emergence of the Greek warriors from the wooden horse in the dark hours before dawn marked the beginning of Troy's final agony, as the small force of infiltrators moved through the sleeping city to open the gates for their comrades who had returned under cover of darkness. The surprise was complete, as the defenders had no warning of the disaster that was about to engulf them. The streets that had echoed with celebration only hours before now rang with the clash of weapons and the screams of the dying as Troy paid the ultimate price for 10 years of resistance. The sack of Troy was characterized by a savagery that exceeded even the brutal standards of ancient warfare, as years of frustration and loss were released in an orgy of destruction that spared neither age nor gender. The great palaces that had housed generations of kings were torn apart by looters seeking treasure, while the temples that had protected the city's sacred objects were desecrated by men who had abandoned all restraint in their hunger for revenge. The systematic destruction of Troy's cultural and religious institutions ensured that the city would never rise again to threaten Greek interests. The fate of Troy's royal family reflected the complete nature of their defeat, as those who were not killed in the fighting were enslaved or executed to prevent any future attempts at restoration. Queen Hecuba, who had lost so many sons during the siege, was forced to witness the murder of her remaining children before being taken into captivity herself. The infant Astyanax, Hector's son, was thrown from the city walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father and reclaim his inheritance. The division of the spoils among the victorious Greeks created new conflicts and resentments that would plague their return journeys and their subsequent reigns. The treasures of Troy, accumulated over centuries of successful trade, were distributed according to complex formulas that attempted to balance merit, contribution, and political necessity, but satisfied no one completely. The allocation of captive women as prizes created personal dramas that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate aftermath of the war. The return journeys of the Greek heroes were marked by disasters that seemed to indicate divine displeasure with the excessive brutality that had characterized Troy's destruction. Many ships were lost to storms that appeared to be supernatural in origin, while others were driven off course to distant lands where their crews faced years of wandering before finding their way home. The gods who had once supported the Greek cause now seemed determined to punish them for violating the sacred laws that were supposed to govern warfare. Agamemnon's homecoming to Mycenae became a tragedy that rivaled any of the disasters that had befallen Troy, as his wife Clytemnestra exacted revenge for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia years earlier. The king who had led the greatest military expedition in Greek history was murdered in his own palace by the woman he had wronged, demonstrating that the violence unleashed by the war would continue to claim victims long after Troy's walls had fallen. The story of the Trojan War, preserved in the epic poems of Homer and countless other works of ancient literature, became the foundational narrative of Western civilization, providing themes and characters that would inspire artists, writers, and thinkers for thousands of years to come. The tale of Helen's beauty, Achilles' rage, Hector's nobility, and Troy's fall created a mythology that spoke to fundamental human experiences of love, loss, honor, and revenge in ways that transcended the specific historical circumstances of Bronze Age warfare. The archaeological discoveries at the site of ancient Troy in modern-day Turkey have provided evidence that the legendary city did indeed exist, and that it was destroyed in a great conflagration around the time that ancient sources placed the Trojan War. While the historical reality was undoubtedly different from the mythological accounts, the essential truth of the story, that great civilizations can fall due to the pride and folly of their leaders, remains as relevant today as it was when Homer first sang of Achilles' wrath and its consequences. The legacy of the Trojan War extends beyond literature and archaeology to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of heroism, the cost of glory, and the relationship between divine will and human choice that continue to resonate with audiences across cultures and centuries, ensuring that the story of Troy's fall will continue to captivate and instruct future generations as it has done for the past 3 millennia.